StudyIQ IAS. अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल.
Welcome back to the series, guys. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the topic of Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is basically a combination of two events. The February and October revolutions that took place in Russia in 1917. These revolutions ended the 300 years long, over 3 centuries long rule of the great Romanov dynasty. This dynasty boasted of many big names in terms of rulers, the most famous being the Peter the Great. So this was a very famous, powerful dynasty of Europe. It comes to an end because of this revolution. It led to the establishment of USSR in 1921, that famous country, which included as many as 15 republics. This country was able to defeat Hitler and for a long time after World War II, challenged the USA for the dominant position of the world. It ensured that the world was not a unipolar world and there were two poles, the other being USSR itself. This revolution gave Russia not only a new type of polity but also a society and economy. The echoes of this revolution did not remain confined to Russia alone. They were heard in distant lands and distant areas. Russian Revolution inspired people from many different countries to aim and aspire for a similar kind of a system. India also, guys, saw a lot of influence of Russian Revolution. It is not a coincidence that CPI in India, Communist Party of India, and CCP, Chinese Communist Party, they are all formed in 1921. Yes, CPI formally will be formed again in 1925. I'm not going into the technicalities, but then the first attempt is in 1921, influenced by Russian Revolution. We have implemented a similar model to Russia's 5-year planned economic model for a large part of our independent history. This was the great influence that this country had. How did this revolution take place? The first part is February Revolution. At the core is that the Tsar is forced to abdicate and in his place, a provisional government is formed. People were fed up of the losses that Russia was suffering in World War I and all the other challenges that it was going through. Already in 1905, there had been a revolutionary upsurge in Russia. That had somehow subsided and the Tsar had survived. But this time during World War I, when again Russians were being beaten back by Germans and Austrians, the Russian people could not stand it. And they rose up and forced the Tsar to abdicate. The second part of the revolution is October Revolution. In this part, the Bolshevik party, which were communists, more aggressive, more extremist kind of communists, under the leadership of Lenin, they took over control of Russia. Instead of the earlier moderate communists who were called as Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks came to power in October of 1917. Together, this is called as the Russian Revolution, the two events. Having now understood at the core what is Russian Revolution, let us see briefly what were its causes. The first was the autocratic and inefficient regime of Tsars. West Europe during the 19th century had liberalized. It had led to development of many modern institutions. The condition of living of people was improving. Industrial revolution was spreading across several countries in West Europe. But Russia continued to remain a semi-medieval feudalistic kind of a society. Its rulers were autocratic and people had very limited freedom. The economy was stagnant and there was very little opportunity for the masses to improve their lot. This made people angry as they compared themselves with what was happening in the West. While all of this was true, the grip of the monarchs was also weakening. There was a type of revolutionary terrorism in Russia that later became popular in other parts of the world also. It's called as nihilism. In nihilism, these revolutionaries assassinated unpopular officials of the state to strike terror in the minds of the administration and remove the fear from the minds of the people. A person no less than the Tsar himself was targeted. And the penultimate Tsar actually lost his life in one such attempt. The serving Tsar had also suffered from many such attempts on his life. This showed that the country's rule was weakening. Third was the wide gap between the upper and lower classes. This was typical of medieval type European societies, where the feudal elite lived a life of luxury and opulence, while the masses, they were living a life under the burden of the upper classes. Liberal and radical ideas from the West had reached Russia. What was happening in France, what was happening in Britain was not unknown to the Russians. Yes, means of communications were not as fast as we, have today, of course. But then it was not as if that Russia was hermetically sealed. Information from the West, new ideas, thoughts were coming. And Russia itself also had many thinkers who were extolling the idea of ideas like socialism, ideas that were emerging in the West like liberalism. So socialism was becoming extremely popular. Tolstoy, Maxim Gorky, the works of such people were increasingly getting popular. Then the arrival or rise of an extremist communist party like Bolsheviks. It was a sect, or sorry, rather than sect, we should say, it was a section within the communists, the Bolsheviks. Led by Lenin, these people were committed to the ideas of Karl Marx. They wanted to bring about a violent revolution in Russia to establish a communist regime there. They were ready to go to any extent to ensure the success of their team. These Bolsheviks would become very crucial in the years to come as they would lead the Russian Revolution. Subject nationalities of Russia, like Finns, Poles, they were unhappy with their rulers. Like other empires, typically, Russia also included many different subject nationalities in Europe as well as in Asia. These people were unhappy with the exploitative nature of Russian rule. Nationalism had animated these Finns, Poles, and Central Asians also. Okay. So these were the major causes that led to a Russian Revolution, guys. Now let us briefly see how the revolution actually went about. We have discussed World War I, and we have seen how Serbia and Austria entered into the conflict. Since Austria declared war on Serbia, automatically Russia entered on behalf of Serbia, Serbia being its natural ally. Serbs were fellow Slav ethnic people. They were strategically located in southeastern Europe. Russia wanted to advance in the direction of Serbia and reach the Mediterranean Sea. And therefore, Serbs were very crucial for Russia's foreign policy goals. Now, when Russians enter from this side, Germany came in from the other side for its friend Austria. Germans and Austrians were a much more advanced industrial society economy. They were able to push back the semi-medieval type of Russian army. Its core was feudalistic, although not in the traditional sense, but it had an elite core of people who were rulers and then common folks or masses. This did not create a very effective kind of army structure. The Germans were able to push back the Russians. Parallelly in Russia, a German princess, Tsarina, the queen, was a German princess. She and her spiritual guru, Rasputin, did not want the war to continue. And therefore, they were constantly conspiring to somehow get the Tsar declare this war over, or in the first place, not even start it. This was not a secret, and people knew about Tsarina and her relationship with the Rasputin and the kind of influence they had over the king. The reverses in the war were seen as because of the treachery that Tsarina and Rasputin were committing. The Russian military complained that it was the government and the Duma that did not allow it to pursue an effective policy. Russians felt that they were left as sitting ducks before the Germans, and very often the Russian military forces actually withdrew from the fronts. They did not fight the war the way they should have. All of this led to a huge public outcry in Russia. People came out on the streets. They murdered this fellow Rasputin, the guru. Workers went on strikes, hartals, etc. And the Duma was forced to take some action. Duma set up a provisional government to deal with the situation and forced the Tsar to abdicate from the throne. The Tsar was compelled to give up on the throne. This provisional government was dominated by middle class or bourgeois politicians. These politicians wanted just basic reforms and at the same time were in favor of continuation of the war. Russia before this had suffered at the hands of Japan in 1904, and in 1856 it was beaten back by Britain and France in the Crimean War. Now, again in 1917, the Russians were being defeated by Germans and Austrians. Therefore, the middle class leaders, the bourgeois, did not want this. They wanted somehow to win the war. So, therefore, they could decide to continue the war. As the war went on, masses started to become even more restless. They were not happy with the moderate reforms that the government was bringing in. Instead, they wanted bigger reforms, more radical reforms. Opposition, therefore, to this new government continued in Russia. Russians were continuing to protest against their own government. Subject nationalities were again up in arms. Earlier against Tsar they were fighting, now they were fighting against this new government. Seizing this opportunity, Mensheviks or moderate communists, they came to power. Their leader being Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky was a moderate communist and he had his own set of agendas. He wanted to continue the war, not stop it, but not for the sake of winning it. He wanted to fight to have an honorable settlement to the war. Settling right away would have given the Germans an upper hand. So he wants the war to go on till they get an honorable settlement. Kerensky was also an incrementalist. So he felt social and political reforms must be done in an incremental manner. In the existing system, slowly, steadily, and step by step, the reforms could be implemented, he felt. These were the ideas of Kerensky. Bolsheviks, on the other hand, the more extremist communists, were opposed to these ideas. Bolsheviks felt that the ideas of Karl Marx must be implemented right away. We must seize power and implement the dream that Karl Marx had given to establish a communist state. Now, who were these Bolsheviks? These Bolsheviks were extremist communist leaders who were opposed to the war, very strongly. They instead wanted to stop the war and establish peace without principle of annexation or indemnities. Without giving anything to the Germans, they wanted to end the war. Second thing, they wanted dictatorship of proletariat. Something what Karl Marx had prophesied will happen someday. They wanted to bring that prophecy, the dream, into reality. For this reason, they violently overthrew the government. They took control of important government institutions and all of a sudden, they attacked the government and ended the rule of the moderate communist government under Mensheviks. Lenin, who secretly came back to Russia from his exile, and his deputy Trotsky led this violent overthrow of the moderate government. This is called as the October Revolution, and in some books you will come across it as November Revolution. Both are the same. This coup takes place in November 1917. As I told you, both the months are the same because some textbooks will refer to October and some would refer to November. Finally, this government was overthrown and the Bolsheviks came to power. Now let us see what does Lenin do after coming to power. Measures of Lenin. Lenin signed a treaty with Germany, which is called as Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. As per this treaty, Russians withdrew from World War I. But what Lenin wanted was a treaty without annexations. This did not happen. It was a humiliating treaty, guys, for the Russians. Russians had to lose a lot of territory which they had occupied since the time of Peter the Great. Okay? For Lenin, protecting the revolution was the biggest goal. And for this, he was ready to sacrifice anything. For him, this was a God-sent sort of an opportunity. God-sent as in Lenin himself was not an atheist like typically communists are. He felt that this was the only chance where the world would ever see a communist revolution and a state established on the ideas of Marx. And therefore, what was at stake was way bigger than some piece of land. So he was ready to give away anything for the sake of ensuring success of the revolution. After this treaty and settling the war, Lenin got down to business, internal issues. As Marx had said, he first abolished the concept of private property. Land was given to the peasant for cultivation, but not as ownership. The farmer was expected to do the same amount of labor, not for himself, but for the communist goal, for the state. He was supposed to cultivate the maximum, and in return, he would not get the full amount of it. Instead, he will only get as much as his needs warranted. Factories and workshops in Russia were seized by the state without paying any compensation to their owners. Workers were now made in charge of the management of these factories. Labor was made compulsory for all citizens. Labor was made compulsory. Orthodox Church, Christian world in Europe was divided primarily into two churches. One was the Roman Catholic Church, and second was the Orthodox Greek Church. This Orthodox Greek Church had influence on the Byzantine or East Roman Empire as well as over Russia. Whereas Roman Catholic Church was influential over the rest of West Europe. Later, this was challenged by Protestants, this church. If you're more interested, you can watch my series on StudyIQ IAS English, where I have discussed these basic concepts. So Orthodox Church was disestablished, like what Maximilian did in France. A reign of terror was unleashed. Anybody who opposed the revolution, opposed Lenin, opposed these ideas, was brutally assassinated or sent to concentration camps. So with use of force, Lenin was able to ensure his control over the Russian state. All right. Now, these measures that Lenin implemented led to economic dislocation and certain changes in Russia. What happened because of these changes? The impact on peasants. Let's see that first. Peasants wanted the lands for themselves, whereas Lenin was not giving it to them. He was only giving it to them for cultivation for the benefit of the state. Farmers were expected to cultivate at the same level without getting the commensurate benefit of it. Therefore, farmers became reluctant to cultivate. They started to reduce the production consciously because there was no incentive for them. How much ever they cultivated, they would only get a small proportion of it. Therefore, they stopped to take the effort. This led to lower production of food and ultimately famine, causing as many as 5 million deaths in Russia. Okay. Workers similarly, who were given the charge of factories, did not have any prior experience of management. While they would have certainly been good workers, it did not necessarily make them good managers. Therefore, when they were given charge of factories, it led to lack of discipline and work outcomes reduced, productions fell, and this led to supply shortages resulting in inflation. So there is a famine, plus there is very high price rise because of low industrial output in Russia. These were the outcomes when Lenin implemented the model of Karl Marx in Russia. The ideas of Karl Marx were very attractive on paper, but practically when they were being implemented, it led to a lot of dislocation. In this context, Lenin brought about the new economic policy, which was his retreat basically from Marxian communism. Lenin understood that Marx's ideas could not be implemented as it is, and therefore he tried a compromise between Marxist communism and capitalism. How did this work? He told the farmers that foodstuff will not be taken away from them. They can produce the maximum they want to and only pay a fixed tax. So the more they produced, the more will be their gain. This gave a clear incentive to the farmer. And because of this incentive, the farmer started to cultivate more, resulting in better food production. Private enterprise was also allowed on a small scale. While earlier he had banned all the private initiatives, now he allowed private sector. Nationalization was limited only to big enterprises, large enterprises, which were crucial for the state, which could lead to big profits, which could lead to inequality. Only those were allowed to be under, only those were not allowed to be under private, otherwise private sector was encouraged. Attracting investments. Lenin attracted foreign investment, gave the foreign capitalists profit sharing arrangements, and in this manner was able to take Russia industrially ahead, completely in contrast to what Karl Marx had said. Private retail trading was also promoted, and the state also set up retail stores. He averted thus the economic crisis that Russia was going through and which would have imminently worsened. These set of measures are called as the New Economic Policy, NEP of Lenin. This is a significant measure, guys, and UPSC has asked a question earlier on this. So I hope you understood the concept of New Economic Policy. After the death of Lenin in 1924, Stalin, a shrewd wolf, he was able to take control of Russia. Although Trotsky had been a close associate and was expected to succeed Lenin, Stalin played his cards well and ensured that he rises to power. After coming to power, he implemented many reforms, the most famous being the 5-year economic model, planned economic model. These 5-year plans, first from 28 to 32 and then from 32 to 37, were massively successful. He focused on industry, especially heavy industry, capital goods industry. Started technical schools, invited foreign trainers. Cooperative farming was used on a big scale. Mechanization was encouraged in farming. Education was prioritized, but that education was an indoctrinated communist style education. And because of this, Russia started to advance rapidly. Religion was discouraged. You remember what Marx said of religion? It is opium of masses. So communists are mostly atheists. Some rare exceptions are there, but then they don't believe in God and religion. Atheism was encouraged and religion was therefore discouraged. The second plan of 1932 to 37 also met with similar success. Now, USSR had a much better quality of life. Their standard of living had improved and the whole world was sitting up and taking notice. It is not a coincidence that the decade of 1920s and 30s sees rise of leftist influence in India also. 1920s and 30s. It is not a coincidence that we established our first planning committee in 1938 when Subhash Babu, a leftist leader, was the president of INC. Okay, so we understood this part of Lenin. Now let us briefly see the foreign policy of Russia or later USSR. This will be important to understand the base for World War II. After coming to power, Lenin wanted to export the Russian Revolution to other parts of the world. For this reason, he established the Third Communist International or Comintern in Moscow. Goal was World Revolution. You must remember the term, guys, World Revolution. He chalked out a program of anti-capitalistic activities, as in how he would go about, sabotaging capitalist governments of the world. For this reason, he wanted to attract other nationalities, especially those who were ruled by European powers. Asiatic people were a special target for this because Russia was physically in close proximity to them. So to attract Asian people, he took many steps. For example, he gave up special privileges in China, which Europeans, including Russia, enjoyed. He gave up his privileges unilaterally to encourage the Chinese to come towards communism. Then he gave up all extraterritorial and financial rights in Turkey also. Turkey, which had been defeated in World War I. He gives up all the special rights that were there in Turkey's areas. He encouraged Afghan people to stand up against the British government. Now, the Afghan people were always at the center stage of the great game of 19th century. This was the rivalry between Britain and Russia, and Afghanistan was a central piece of that. So he encouraged the Afghan people to fight against the Britishers to get full independence. There was a lot of autonomy in any case, but foreign policy, etc., were still under British control. So in 1922, Afghanistan would gain full independence with Russian encouragement. All of this isolated Russia and alienated major powers from it. Other major powers, the Western powers, saw the danger that Lenin posed to their overall well-being. He did not like their model. He was trying to instigate their colonies. He was trying to encourage his way of life, socio-politico-economic, in other parts of the world. So he was a very dangerous man from the perspective of Western powers. These were the initial years. But soon, Lenin realized that it is not a good idea to have conflict with the West. So he ultimately decides to give up on this idea of world revolution. Instead, from 1921, he starts to develop good relations with the West. This same policy was continued by Stalin further. Stalin continued this same policy. He focused on revolution in Russia itself. If we make this revolution successful in Russia, then automatically others will get attracted. There is no need to go and encourage other people and tell them to follow us. Become awesome ourselves and others will automatically come to us, is the idea. Seeing this change of heart, Russians were allowed to join the League of Nations in 1934. The West somewhat gave up its reservations on Russia and allowed it to enter in League of Nations. Relations with France and England also improved, but this slowly started to change when there was rise of Hitler and Japan in the vicinity. Hitler, which was on western side of Russia, was rising very fast, and Hitler was making all the wrong noises for Russia. USSR felt that it can be threatened by Hitler in future, and also Imperial Japan, with whom there was an old rivalry, was becoming a major imperialist industrial power in that time. So Stalin was concerned on both the sides. One side Japan, another side Hitler. Now, while Hitler was rising, France and England did not take tough action against Hitler. And this led Stalin to believe that all of this was being done to make Hitler powerful against USSR. And perhaps not wrongly so. He could clearly see that France and England go easy on Hitler despite all the dadagiri that he was doing in Europe. And therefore, he decides to turn the tables on France and England. What does he do? He signs a pact of neutrality with Hitler himself. In 1938, he signed a 10-year agreement with Hitler of mutual non-aggression. This turned the table on France and England, who had earlier been more indulgent, appeasing towards Hitler. Now suddenly, Hitler became the enemy of France and England. So these are the major foreign policy changes of that time, guys. One second. Now lastly, we will see the significance of this revolution. What is the importance of Russian Revolution? Importance number one, it ended a monarchical form of government and established a new type of rule, the communist rule. Romanov dynasty, 300 years old, was finally over. And instead, we have a republic based on communist ideas. He proved that Marx wasn't just a doctrinaire, that is, Marx just did not give hypothetical ideas. Those could actually be tried out on the ground. Russian Revolution gave the planned economic model to the world. Thanks to Stalin, this model became popular. Even Hitler will implement 4-year plans. So even Hitler copied this idea. Nationalization of resources was implemented in earnestness. This will be copied by countries across the world. India, we ourselves have nationalized so many different sectors. Coal, earlier banking sector, and many other sectors. Airlines also once upon a time were nationalized. Stalin encouraged industrial revolution in USSR. In a span of just 10 years, he was able to leapfrog USSR's industrial development. And so much so that it was strong enough to even defeat Hitler and then become a rival of USA. Infrastructure, education were focused upon. Ideas such as collectivization of agriculture were implemented. Earlier thought was cooperative farming, and then later it was modified to collective farming. The concept is given in NCERT, so I'm not explaining the difference here. Role of religion was divested. State was completely secular and atheism was encouraged. So this, in a way, tried to reduce the excesses that were associated with religion-dominated society. Communism did not remain limited to USSR alone. It found wings and spread to other parts of the world. China will undergo a revolution of itself in 1949, and communism will become influential in Korea, in Vietnam, and in many other countries of the world. In India also, there was a time when Communist Party used to be the single largest opposition party. It used to be the single largest opposition party. Kerala became the first state in India where communists came to power through democratic means. West Bengal enjoyed a long communist rule. Social and economic equality were aimed for the masses. Encouragement to subject nationalities. In the early years, definitely, the subject nationalities were a lot more happy. They felt they had now the room and the independence and equality within USSR. While this will change later, but initially at least it was the case. It was able to defeat Hitler in World War II, which was not a mean achievement. It came at a lot of cost. The Russians demonstrated a lot of resilience in defending their fatherland. We call it motherland, they refer to it as fatherland, against invading army of Hitler. Ultimately, Cold War, which dominated world politics for almost 5 decades, the effects of which can be traces of which can be seen and felt even today, was because of USSR's strength. It was the second pole to USA. Bipolar world was ensured because of USSR. These were the great significances of this revolution. On this note, guys, I'll conclude this lecture. In my next session, I will discuss the interwar period, developments like League of Nations, the Great Depression, and rise of fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany, respectively. Thank you very much.
StudyIQ IAS. अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल।